Everybody's coming. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of people.
Yes. And this is only in Zoom. We have people in YouTube as well.
Streaming, yeah.
Okay, I think I can start, right, guys? Anybody in the waiting room? No. Okay. Good. Welcome back to the Security Academy. This is an event, this panel. We are co-partnering here with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I have to thank Özgür Ünlü, who is the director of Ankara office of German Marshall Fund, who agreed to put together this event for the Security Academy with International Relations Council. We have three excellent speakers for today. We have Ian Lesser, who is Vice President of GMF, but also Director of GMF Brussels office. We have Alexandra de Scheffer. She is the Director of GMF Paris office. So we have two people from Europe, but we are expecting Ian to double his head as an American. And we have Soli Özel from Kadir Has University in Istanbul. We have people listening in through YouTube and Zoom platform. You can ask your questions both in YouTube and also if you are in Zoom in the chat section. All of them will come to me and I'll try to direct to our speakers. We have relatively short event. This is about 1 hour event, and that's why I'm not going to introduce anybody any longer. Just this short introduction is enough. Everybody, you have your own folders. You have the longer resumes there. This is a panel trying to see what is expecting us in 2021. As we all experiencing still, 2020 was a kind of annus horribilis. It started with very wrongfully and it's continuing very wrong way. So let me start with Ian. What do you see, Ian, as we announced geopolitical outlook for the world in 2021?
Well, Mustafa, thank you very much. It's nice to be here with you and colleagues and friends. You've started us out on such an optimistic note. I mean, I'm not sure where I can take you from that. I mean, I was noticing, I jotted down a few, all right, what are the three things I'm going to tell you in 7 minutes that I think are, sort of characterizing the world that we're going to see this year? I mean, the first one is very obvious. I think we've entered a kind of, an age of anxiety, if I can put it that way. We know about a lot of these forces that were already at work. People talk about the pandemic as an accelerator. I don't know. I think that's debatable. It would be an interesting thing for us to talk about because I think in some ways that's true, but we could probably think of things that are actually slowed down by the pandemic, including in the geopolitical realm. But I think broadly, it's sort of reinforced this desire for protection in societies, but it's also spurred a debate about what exactly that means. Protection against what? By whom? How do you define all of this? I think there is in some ways also a narrowing of perspectives, as the nationalism and populism, but also I would say a kind of exceptionalism in many countries. In my country, the United States, we've gone through our own sort of experience of this, but you see it also in Europe. You see it, I think, in Turkey. You see it in many other places, certainly in China. That you have in some ways also a closing in and a sort of focus on issues of identity, security of identity, all of these things that we are very uncomfortable dealing with, at least among foreign policy elites. And that's basically who you've assembled here today. I mean, I'm unapologetic about this, but we also need to be clear that we're in kind of a mood of revolt against elites. But it's not just the elites. It's their projects, alliances, trade agreements, science in many ways is under assault. So that's part of what we're dealing with. And I think these things are especially edgy, especially difficult on issues that are kind of at the seam, at the intersection of the domestic and the international. intermestic things, migration, trade, health, internal security, all of these things, age of anxiety. The second point, very briefly, I think we have seen a kind of fraying of the links between geopolitics and geoeconomics that can be very destabilizing. Unfortunately, I think my own country in the United States in the last years has been one engine of this, but there have been others. The idea that somehow you can decouple things like trade relationships from both alliance and adversarial relationships. There was something quite stabilizing, for example, between the United States and China about our economic interdependence. If you don't have that sense on both sides anymore, it seems to me it increases the risk of things we already knew were risky, whether it's in the South China Sea or over Taiwan or other things. So I think you see a redoubling of risks around these flashpoints, precisely because we're no longer necessarily connecting the dots among those things. Now, finally, I don't know, maybe you want to talk more specifically about the United States and about the election, but all that, we can do that. But I think Biden will make a big difference. I know there's a school of thought out there that says that this is no panacea, the world has moved on, there are no resets. There's some truth in that, of course, but it will make a big difference. If you just run the thought experiment of a Trump victory and imagine what world we'd be talking about, it makes a difference. The style makes a difference. The ability to connect those dots between things like trade and security, which this administration will do, will make a difference. Finally, just let me end with this. I think if it weren't for all of these huge domestic distractions in the United States, Biden would probably be the most foreign policy minded president we've had, naturally foreign policy minded president since George H.W. Bush. And he surrounded himself with people who know this world very, very well. So that I find reassuring, and I can therefore leave you on maybe a little more optimistic note. But happy to come back on any of these things, Mustafa.
Okay, great introduction. Though I'm not sure that everybody would share your reference to George W. Bush, whether he was
the father.
The father. All right. Okay, that one. That's okay. Okay, let me go to Europe. Alexandra, you have what, 5, 6, 7 minutes? Let me have your first thoughts. Your sound is still closed. Let me try to open it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
yeah,
great.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be also on a panel with my colleague Aydın and Soli Özel. And it's true that we are lucky as the German Marshall Fund to have offices on both sides of the Atlantic. Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Warsaw, Belgrade, Bucharest, but also Ankara with my friend Özgür, and our headquarters in Washington. So everything we actually do, for myself in Paris, Aydın in Brussels, has both a national, European, and very quickly transatlantic dimension. But also global, because we're well known for our Asia program as well. I wanted to make 4 quick remarks, and obviously I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I must say I'm extremely impressed by the number of people who are attending this webinar, so that's extremely energizing, and thank you all for joining us in this conversation. The first point I wanted to make is that we have been entering an era of less cooperation and more competition, number one. Second, about US leadership, I think the US leadership is going to become much more selective in global terms. Third, the 21st century will be increasingly shaped by the US-China geostrategic and technological competition. And I really want to emphasize the tech dimension because this will be extremely present also under the Biden administration. And very lastly, I want to close on what I would call an era of increasing strategic simultaneity, which means that the crisis and COVID has shown that we will be increasingly facing as nations will be simultaneous crisis. COVID was a health crisis, but very quickly spilled over into an economic crisis, political, strategic, security crisis. And this kinds of puts a sort of urgency and pressure on governments, but also experts like us to rethink the traditional paradigm of security. So number one, an era of competition and less cooperation. I think COVID really showed that in a quite dramatic way, that we were unable to address the COVID crisis in a collective multilateral way. And there, that links me to the second point on US leadership. When the US leadership is not playing its traditional role of coalition builder, then it is much more difficult actually to formulate collective multilateral responses to global challenges. And that was, again, to me, extremely striking in the COVID-19 crisis. The other thing that I see coming and increasing is what I would call the regionalization of power and cooperation, because the big international institutions like the United Nations, the WTO, the WHO, in the case of the COVID crisis, for example, didn't play their role and have difficulties being reformed, actually. What we see also is that the regional level of cooperation has been increasingly enhanced in terms of security, in terms of trade, in terms of economic relationships. And that makes multilateralism to a certain extent much more local. I would basically say it's much more about thinking of regional solutions for regional problems, which is not a problem, in fact. It's a very much more, I would say, pragmatic way of tackling challenges today, and maybe a way that is more anchored in different geographies and different set of priorities. So what I'm seeing increasing is a sort of flexible multilateralism, where more and more countries, based on their geography, on their proximity, on their common strategic visions, will gather in a critical mass under an informal format of cooperation, contact groups, and will try to cooperate on precise issues. Which leads me to the second point, US leadership. I think that what we have seen already with Obama, with Trump, and we'll see that also with Biden, is a much more selective US leadership. By that, I mean that the US leadership will be more inward looking. You see that trend also in Europe, obviously. You will have also a focus, and a real big focus on the China challenge, but also the technological challenge, and I'll come back to that. But what's striking to me is that you have a continuum. It's very important for those who in this webinar are passionate about international relations, or studying international relations, or maybe writing a PhD on a specific international relations topic, to look at the deep trends that are defining countries' foreign policies. What's interesting is to take the continuum between Obama, Trump, and Biden. You all remember the nation building at home formula of Obama, especially in the context of the Libya intervention, where he's saying, sorry, the US is not going to lead. We're going to support the French, UK leadership there, but our priority is to do nation building at home and not do nation building abroad. Then you had America First. That was, again, a strengthening of that sort of inward looking, as Ian Lesser said, a sort of protective approach to leadership. And now you have Biden, who has called his future foreign policy a foreign policy for the American middle class. And so I agree with Ian that there is an increasing link to be made between the domestic politics and the foreign policies of countries, and that probably we have not paid enough attention to the domestic politic trends and how they enormously shaped foreign policy orientations. And so, yes, I believe that the United States wants to close the 9/11 chapter. We've seen it with Afghanistan, with Iraq, the way they didn't want to engage in Libya, they didn't want to engage in Syria, the way they want to reduce their military footprint, especially in Africa, but also in the Middle East. And so we're going more and more from a period of projection to a period of protection. And that also answers what American citizens, but also European citizens are looking for when they are asked, what should your government be doing? Should it be more engaged in crisis management and in development aid? What do you want your government to do? And the response you increasingly get, especially now in the COVID context, is we want our government to focus on the economics, on health, on protecting the people. The last thing I wanted to say about US leadership is that obviously this has consequences for us, for Europeans, and GMF is one of the big actors of thinking about the transatlantic relationship today and how it will evolve in the future. What it means to have a more selective US leadership is that obviously there are going to be expectations for Europeans to carry more of what we call the burden. I rather, say, let's think of sharing responsibilities rather than sharing the burden, but that's the usual term we use. But that's a fact. The US will be more focused on China, on how to preserve its technological supremacy, even though it's losing it in certain domains, as we all know. But then that means that Europeans will be expected to take more responsibilities, especially in managing their neighborhoods, southern neighborhood, but also eastern neighborhood. And as you know, I always say to my European American colleagues, I sit in Paris. Paris is the capital of strategic autonomy, right? This is the place where the debate is the strongest. We have been, raising awareness about the need to anticipate a less engaged United States, especially in Europe's neighborhoods, and therefore the need for Europeans to develop more capabilities and a stronger strategic approach to its neighborhoods, so that in a potential future scenario where the US will say, sorry, this is not of vital interest for the United States, or where NATO as a military alliance will not be the most adequate organization, then it will fall to Europeans to act. And finally, that's my last word, an era of strategic simultaneity. I think that's something that we really learned with the COVID crisis and that we have probably put aside before the COVID crisis, but more and more the crisis that we will face are hybrid crises, are a set of multiple crises: environmental, health, economic, strategic, security, military. And so there is a need for us, United States, Europeans, Turkey, to think of these scenarios together today, to think also of the tools that we should be using to address these multiple threats so that we are more ready to address a sort of COVID-like future crisis. And so I think this should be really our priority. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alexandra. I think that was a good expose. Soli, how do you see the world from Istanbul? It was supposed to be one of the nicest cities, but maybe your sound. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, Alexandra, I won't thank you because you just stole all my show away from me. And it's not bad to repeat what you said, but you've done it so in such an orderly fashion. Now I'm just blabbering. Anyway, thank you for that. I usually follow whatever Ian says and then put my signature under what he says. But at this time, I would dissent on the second point he made, that we will be seeing and that's that. I think if you presented it as an exception, that the links between geopolitics and geoeconomics have been loosened. The thing is, the fact that you had close trade relations did not prevent wars from emerging. And the good example for that was the period before First World War, when I think Germany was Russia's #1 trade partner. But anyway, this is something we may discuss. What I would say is, first of all, I think 2020 may basically live in infamy for the rest of history, but to the extent that it had a positive contribution, it has exposed a lot of things that maybe the elites were not willing to see. And in a way, this is the year when all the chickens are coming home to roost. And so it's a question, maybe 2020, if it is explored well, is the year of awakening on a number of issues, from climate to China, to the evil that tech companies can and do become, to the evils of inequality, to corrosion of states, to women power, to the near total absence of communication between elites and masses, to how close fascism can be, as we have witnessed really on live in the American electoral process and immediately afterwards. So I think, therefore, that 2021, not just that year, but the decade that it begins, is going to be the period when the world to come is going to be shaped. And a lot will hinge on the United States, and whether or not, in the United States, the establishment like to consider Trump a blimp. And I think the question is going to be that we will face in 2024, maybe Biden was the blimp. And that is as critical a question as I can see in terms of how the world is going to be shaped in this coming decade. Secondly, this will be a year or a decade when we will see if the European Union will really be able to make much of itself in strategic terms. And in that sense, going back to what Alexandra has said, will the European Union be able to actually rise to the challenge that a more disengaged United States will actually present it in transatlantic relations? What I think is going to be as important is how Europe responds and what it has on offer as what the United States wishes to do with Europe. And that really goes, as she said, beyond the issue of burdens and whatever. Thirdly, yes, the issue of technology is going to be important. And I'd like to stress, to the extent that and that I thought that was going to be my big point, she said it, the relation between domestic politics and the international system, which has become much clearer and much more punctuated. And in that sense, the technology issue is not just which technology do you choose. Ivan Krastev, a colleague of ours, of us all, says that during the Cold War, it was your ideological preferences that determined your side. And in this case, it will be your technological preferences. And of course, just a couple of days ago, the Germans were giving hell to Huawei in terms of the 5G technology and what role it will or it will not play. But that's only one aspect of the technology issue. If we agree that technology will also have a role to play in how we organize domestically, then the evil that the technology companies are proving themselves to be will have to be dealt with. And that's why I think there is an awakening on this issue, because not being able to deal with their monopoly power, not being able to actually contain the power that they have been accumulating, will suggest, or at least the ability to do or not to do so, will determine whether or not we can actually still have a hold on our lives personally and as societies, or whether or not we will be joining an Orwell Huxley world, which I hope we won't have to live in. Fourth, the shadiness and shakiness of values, principles, this, that, and the other, as opposed to interest. And that will really be testing the mettle of the Western world, to the extent that Biden will try to differentiate himself domestically from Trump and internationally from China by emphasizing this issue of rule of law, democracy, and human rights. We'll see whether or not the United States and the European Union will be able to live to those high principles. The fact that prior, 2 days before the EU summit, which was also supposed to punish Hungary and Poland for their behavior, and it ended up not doing so, President Macron received one of the nicest guys in the world, General Sisi, and then gave him a Légion d'honneur, I think speaks volumes. And that should be a dark day for the European Union and its pretenses. 5, flexible alliances, she said. And of course, rise of regional powers. And depending on how China and the United States behave, we will also be seeing whether or not regional powers will prefer bandwagoning or balancing. And maybe they will do both depending on the issue. Finally, 6, Turkey. All of those, in my, if not all of those, many of those issues really do put Turkey under the spotlight. And Turkey, first of all, will have to really analyze the new world. It is not going to be the world that we saw between 2010 and 2020, and definitely not 2016 and 2020. I am not quite sure that Turkey is yet ready to understand what the next decade is going to be all about. It may stick to its guns in terms of its geopolitical assets alone, and that may actually not be enough. And it will have to make choices about its strategic identity as well as its domestic identity. However lightly the issue of values, principles, democracy, human rights might end up being taken by its Atlantic partners. So we will have to reassess our relations with Europe, with the European Union. And I think it will also be incumbent upon the European Union to have finally maybe a sensible approach to Turkey, whether or not they like the current rulers of Turkey. Thank you.
Okay. Before going questions from the audience, let me pose a question in. Both Alexandra and Soli talk about their global vision. So let me allow you also to this question. How do you see the global political system evolving in the next 4 years, let's say, under Biden administration? Please link this with the differences between Biden and Trump perceptions about the US identity in that world. How do you see the challenges that US is facing in the next 4 years? Your sound is still closed. Ian, could you open your sound?
Did you? Yeah, Ian.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Pressing the button, but it didn't work. Maybe it's a metaphor for the system, an international system.
Yeah.
Look, there are some structural, and Alexandra spoke, actually Soli as well, about this sort of tension between some of the things that are going on a structural basis and things that are more amenable to sort of personality and to policy choices and to events. And, structurally, if you're thinking about American leadership in this world, which, many people have characterized as increasingly leaderless, no one's world, there are lots of different formulas. Certainly it's becoming more diffuse in terms of power, but, and the question of China, which we've all spoken about, is there for us all to see. Now, is the United States how is the United States going to respond to this? And how is it going to affect Europe, Turkey? Look, this crowd that's coming in with Biden is about as Atlanticist as you could possibly get. But that said, there are things happening structurally that are going to compel increasing American attention to the competition with China and to flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's simply not going to change. And in fact, it could be accelerated almost overnight if something really goes wrong there. So, in a big picture sense, in a systemic way, you could say, well, maybe we're coming to the end of a 100-year American pivot to Europe. I mean, we are, after all, a bioceanic power. That's always been part of our makeup. and that will play itself out. The question, though, is, and Europe, of course, is also facing these dilemmas. So, but the point is, I think the instincts from Washington now will be to try to manage some of this, including in relation to China, with Europe. And that will be a difference. There is this issue about multilateralism. I mean, it's the conventional wisdom is that Trump, didn't like multilateralism, didn't like institutions, saw the world through individual countries, even individual leaders, personalized everything. I think there's some truth to this. Biden represents, in that respect, a return to something much more traditional. So you will have, I think, this tension between a very traditional sort of foreign policy outlook on the one hand, and these more insurgent tendencies, on the other. And these things are going to play themselves out, in things like the relationship between Turkey and the United States, which is very troubled, obviously. There's a values dimension, there's a practical dimension. In fact, both of them have been dysfunctional in recent years. It's going to be very hard to fix, and it may be more a matter of sort of stabilizing it. But again, to answer the systemic question, it may be that we're facing, in fact, a lot of situations like that aren't amenable to being fixed in the same way anymore. Relationship with Egypt, we can make a long list. You can simply sort of stabilize them and hedge against things going wrong. So I think this hedging dimension to strategy is going to become much more important. We like to think we can shape things. People talking about shaping all the time. Maybe there'll be less shaping and more hedging. And the pandemic finally, it reminds us that we can be very surprised by things that we thought were unthinkable or didn't bother to think about. What on earth is next? I mean, the obvious one to worry about is some sort of nuclear use. And that we could talk about that. But if I were going to worry about something for the future, I think it would be that.
Great. I think Soli wants to come just a short half a minute.
Yeah,
And also Alexandra. Okay.
In fact, Filiz Hanım after me just wrote her own question. I was just going to say we didn't mention Russia at all, and Russia can fall into a constructive or a very destructive spot in the next decade. I don't know exactly where it will fall, and that may very well be the bigger challenge for the Europeans than it is maybe for the US. When you answer Filiz Hanım's question, you may address that it appears the Bidenites want to pick a fight with Russia rather than with China. But my sense is it will be more a European challenge than anything else.
Okay. I know Alexandra wants to come in. I mean, just on this precise point, Soli, I think in this respect, probably the strategic priorities for the Biden administration are not going to be that much different from the ones that were identified by Trump. I mean, they were very, very clear that China was number one, Russia was number two, and everything else was a rather distant three. Honestly, I don't like the way that strategy was implemented, that worldview was implemented, but it's a reflection of reality. I don't think that's going to change.
Okay, Alexandra, you want to come in for this? Okay. There is a question. Let me put it there also. You can respond to that. And Ian, this is also for you. This is coming from YouTube. Hüseyin Bağcı, professor, you might know him already. He's saying that is Turkey a troublemaker, or are there lots of troubles in the world?
Oh gosh.
All right. Well, yes, Alexandra, you
are, but you're not the only one. Let me put it that way. I mean, my own has had a good run at that vocation recently. So.
Yeah, maybe we have too many troublemakers in this world today. Not enough, suiting people. Alexandra, yes.
Yeah, no, just on your question on the United States, and if we project ourselves, how should we be thinking about the role of the United States in the world in the years to come? I think that one thing that will remain from Trump is that he has put at the heart of the U.S. foreign policy debate the question about how much does it cost for the United States to be internationally engaged. Everything that he has tried to do is to bring more reciprocity, is about, his transactionalism, was about, to rebalance or to have the United States get repaid some of its implications abroad. But I think this theme about how much does it cost the United States to be engaged in that or that trade agreement, to be engaged in the transatlantic alliance in NATO will remain. And you see that also, with the Biden team, that I think the longer term objective of the United States will basically be about how does it maintain its power at the lowest possible costs. And there I link it with what Ian said, which is this is where allies, European allies, but also Asian allies will naturally play an increasing role in US foreign policy, because wanting to maintain the American power at the lowest possible cost will mean trying to share these costs with allies, Europeans to manage their neighborhoods, but Asians like Australia, South Korea, India, Japan, to try also and counterbalance Chinese increasing military power in the Indo-Pacific. So everything is actually linked and leads to an enhancement of the role of American allies.
Great. Alexandra, before moving on, could you also talk a little bit about how do you see EU's role in world politics evolving? There was a challenge from Soli, of course, whether EU could raise up to the challenge that it needs to raise up. Could you just a little bit talk on that?
Yeah, well, as you know, the objective of the current European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen has been to make the EU a geopolitical power. I think that's the right aim, but then how do you get to that is another story. What I see rather happening is less the EU as a geostrategic actor, but more groups of European countries trying to build coalitions, powerful coalitions on certain issues, and trying to raise that at the EU level. I'm taking, for example, the case of tech, of technological so-called sovereignty. That's the kind of obsession right now of the EU, is how to not be dependent on, less dependent on US technologies, and how to resist Chinese Huawei or 5G technologies, and how therefore to raise the European profile on technological issues. And what we've seen happening actually this year, and I think that the COVID crisis has been an accelerator of this awareness that there is a need to build digital resilience in today's world and future world. There have been a lot of interesting initiatives on semiconductors, on batteries, on many of these issues. And this has very often begun with European coalitions, a few countries gathering together and then raising that at the EU level. So I think that, this sort of EU process of gaining more content in terms of geopolitics, geoeconomics, will very much follow this bottom-up trend. And you see that actually happening also on security and defense. France obviously is one of the major players in trying to push for more capabilities, more strategic autonomy, especially looking at the sovereign challenges we're facing. And we've seen that, Germany has been also moving closer to the French perspective, especially when it comes to Africa, probably encouraged by the Syrian refugees coming to Germany. But things are moving. And just to close with that, and that leads to the US leadership, the way the United States and the Biden administration will also posture itself vis-a-vis European, strategic autonomy or sovereignty in critical areas will be absolutely key. Washington needs to change its narrative and its attitude, especially when it comes to European defense and European defense industry. So it's all the same. It's part of the full package, if I can say.
Okay, Soli, could you allow me, before coming to you, I'd like to ask Ian a small question. Ian, you are an American citizen, but living in Europe for some years now, and in the capital of Europe, so to speak. And it's always been one of the consistent complaints of the American administrations that Europe is not doing enough, not shouldering enough in the security aspect and other aspects. How do you see whether the EU is really ready to raise the challenge, as Soli put it? Because sitting in Istanbul, I can comment that Europe is not doing enough in the Black Sea, in the Caucasus, in the Mediterranean, or in the Middle East. How do you see, as an American living in Europe?
Well, I mean, it does depend a little bit on the perspective you take. I mean, if you take a national perspective, certainly there are countries, France being in the lead, who are extremely active in terms of managing security in the European periphery. If you look at what France is engaged doing in the Sahel, you know, rightly or wrongly, the policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, I mean, there is an activism there for sure. In terms of the Balkans, this is a place where the US had a leadership role for many years, but in fact, it basically divested itself of that and turned it over to Europe some years ago. I mean, I think, you know, the problem is, of course, if you're looking at sort of high-end capacities for deterrence and defense, about Russia, for example, above all, then, you know, you're talking about substantial investments. And there's always going to be this American concern that, you know, NATO should be the key pole in this. And that's probably true in terms of effectiveness. You know, this is an old story, this debate about burden sharing. All administrations come to Europe with the same request. The Trump line was much more aggressive, much more assertive, and had embedded in it this idea that either you do more, you pay more, or we're going to do less. You know, there was this bargain in there somehow. It was conditional. I mean, that's what was different in addition to the rhetoric. I mean, with Biden, you're going to go back to something more traditional. And I think it's likely to be measured in different ways. It's not just about whether countries are spending 2% of their on defense. There are other kinds of contributions. I mean, sure, Europe should be doing more. These are places, especially if you think about the Mediterranean and the broader Mediterranean, these are places Europe can reach, where Europe has capacity. There's more a problem of political choice within the European Union to actually do things. And that's where the progress has to come. And if strategic autonomy is the way to get there, I think many American foreign policy elites will accept that.
Okay. Soli, I mean, of course, you can react anything that you hear so far, but also could you a little bit more comment on this rise of regionalism, regional powers? How are you seeing challenges to the international system, especially from the regional powers, whether unilaterally or in combination of in partnership with each other?
Well, I mean, we've already seen the challenges of regional powers to the international system. Turkey is a good example, and obviously, independent of the style with which it conducts its foreign policy, which actually rubs a lot of people both abroad and here the wrong way, is not liked. Even if Turkey was nicer, it would not have been liked, because it does challenge the existing hierarchy. I mean, if there is one slogan that Turkey's rulers have that I really do like, is that the world is bigger than five, and that's prescient in my view. I mean, I'll take exception again to what Ian said about France in particular. I don't know what the hell they do in Sahel. They haven't done anything in the Caucasus. They have really no right to complain, therefore, that in the Caucasus something happened that they didn't like, that Turkey has taken an initiative and helped Azerbaijan. And the same thing goes almost everywhere that they're meddling. I don't find a strategic actor, or the definition of a strategic actor, to be that you would be confrontational rather than try to figure out, like the United States had done on numerous occasions in the 80s and in the 90s, come between the parties and try to actually calm the waters down and see if you can actually broker an agreement between them. Therefore, yes, the French talk the talk of strategic autonomy, and they make a lot of claims, but they don't seem to be finding any allies to help them in Europe to actually pursue those policies, or they can convince them that the French way is the right way. in that sense, I really do think Europe really has a lot of thinking and a lot of exercise to do before it can actually present itself a co-equal of the other three major economic powers that we see in the world. India, Brazil, those are not going to be countries that are going to take laying down whatever comes to them from the international system. That's what I meant. There will be challenges, and they will prefer bandwagoning sometimes, and they will prefer challenging at other times. India probably does need the support of the United States, but India is not going to be doing everything that the United States demands of it. They say this explicitly, and in fact, they even practice it. The same kind of, but where do you find the equilibrium point between either China and some other regional powers and the United States and some other regional powers will probably depend on the case.
Okay, there are two groups of questions. I'll ask the first group, then we'll talk the second group. Actually, Karel Valenci in our platform here started a very good part of it. She says that turbulence in international affairs is not new, but the diversity of challenges we face today rivals some of the most consequential periods in history. Can we expect a systemic transformation of the global order, a new form of multilateralism? And actually, Alexandra already talked about several different threats, crises, combining each other. And there are other questions, some of them, for example, asking whether social classes matter in world politics, world geopolitics in this day and age. Another question is about, here, let me see. It's about increasing risk of climate challenge on states. Are we going to see a new movement against this challenge? There is a question also about a new type of weapons coming, supersonic weapons. So this increasing hybrid threats. So this is kind of a group of questions related to new types of threats coming together at the same time, suddenly jumping on us, when the traditional way of responding to them, the one that we learned, the multilateral cooperation, seems to be weakening. So how are we going to come out of all these threats if we are not able to cooperate internationally, globally, multinationally? Let me start with Ian again.
Okay, and I apologize in advance because
Yes.
I have to drop off shortly, but it's been a fantastic conversation. I need more opportunities to disagree with Soli because it so rarely happens. But listen, I mean, what have we come to at least accept? I mean, one thing is, complacency. We were awfully complacent about the stability of the system that we had, our institutions, the competence of our leaders, all of these things. We got rather complacent, and including about geopolitics as a whole. I mean, that's gone. I mean, the complacency is gone, along with this anxiety that we've spoken about. The complacency is gone, and there are lessons here. Soli, I think you mentioned the First World War in the beginning, but it's an apt analogy in a way, because if you want to think about a system that was very well integrated at a certain level, with elites, someone asked a question about social class and so on, that basically were all on the same plate. They had a very similar worldview. They
were cousins.
They were related. They had nicknames for each other, etc. So well, we don't have that now, but we have a certain kind of complacency about the system. That's really gone. I mean, and if you look at how quickly that fell apart as a result of there are various theories on this. We could have another event, many events to talk about it. But anyway, nobody will disagree that you went from a state of kind of equilibrium to complete chaos in a very, very short period of time, a period of weeks even. And that was at a time when things moved a lot more slowly than they do today. I think we need to be reminded of that, the fragility of whatever. We can talk about the nature of the system and where it's headed, but the pure point about its fragility or its stability, I think we need to be reminded not to be complacent about that.
Okay.
Thank you
very much.
Good to be with you. I wish you all a very
good to have you here.
New Year.
Ian,
Sorry that
on
we are
this-
losing you.
On this issue of complacency, I'm 200% with you. So let's depart from the agreement.
What a wonderful way to end.
But
I could
don't
go-
worry, we are going to keep talking behind you.
No, I won't.
See you
I'm waiting
later.
for what he's going to say once I'm gone. Anyway, Thank you.
Alexandra,
Thank you
I'll
very
come
much.
back. Yes,
It's a
thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
bye, everyone. Alexandra, bye.
Alexandra. Let's have you, Alexandra. The same question. Your sound is closed now. Okay.
Okay,
great.
yeah, sorry. No, so on the questions, and thank you very much for the extremely interesting questions that your participants have been asking on, the multilateral, on the sort of what we call global governance question. I think there are several trends to watch. One is a sort of multilateralism, as we would say in French, à la chinoise, a sort of multilateralism with the Chinese characteristics that is emerging, and that has been accelerating because of the United States disinvestment, political, financial disinvestments from many of the multilateral organizations these last 4 years. You see how China wants to convert its increasing economic weight into a more political, geopolitical influence, and that translates extremely well, if I can say, from if you look at that from a Chinese strategy in the international organizations. That's something that is there to remain. How do you manage that? I think is a challenge, but that links to the question of should we invest time and energy in reforming institutions like WTO, like the United Nations. Obviously, there is a crisis of multilateralism, and they don't obviously reflect the 21st century world politics and equilibrium of power. So there is a reform agenda, but are we willing to do that? Is the United States, is the Biden administration willing to work with Europeans, with Asian allies on that? I'm not so sure. So what you are seeing is more of a sort of ad hocism, a multiplication of different ad hoc formats. The one that Biden has been speaking about, a summit for democracies, is another ad hoc multilateral organization, which basically would be a G7 enlarged to Australia, to probably India and South Korea, for example. So it's a sort of a pragmatic way of trying to bring together like-minded countries to deal with specific issues, which I think is not a problem. Basically, it's whatever works from the moment that we have some progress on certain critical issues that require collective responses. And the last thing I wanted to add is that, and obviously the COVID crisis has really shown that, is that, and you said it, Mustafa, we need to surpass our traditional diplomatic ways of addressing global challenges. We cannot only have heads of states addressing the challenges today. You need to build and reinforce public-private partnerships. You need to work with private companies, and you need also to work with cities more and more. The power of cities in terms of global governance is increasing. And you had an example, I think it was in 2018, that there was the first U20 that was launched, the Urban 20, which is a sort of gathering of the world's largest cities. And which had a really strong agenda in terms of the future of cities and how cities are sometimes more powerful than states in terms of putting out there some really concrete and good proposals when it comes to thinking of global governance. So there are all of these, different, I would say, non-state actors that have an increasing voice in the agenda setting on the international scene. And I'm not even mentioning digital companies that sometimes play almost the role of states as well in their own domain. And so we will need to work in a much more hybrid way to answer these increasingly hybrid challenges.
Okay, great. I think you also had to leave, Alexandra. Thank you very much for joining us. This was a great, thank you. Hope to see you again.
But Alexandra, I have to say, on the cities, I was with you back in 2018, 2019. I'm not quite sure because, you know, as you know, there is a major debate now whether or not the cities will be able to recover the impact of the COVID crisis. So that is still something that we need to think and talk more about, especially in terms of cities fundings. And in the United States, many cities and states are going to basically lose a lot of power because they will not have the money. But anyway, that's maybe another, I would suggest we should have another dialogue on that one. Thank you.
I'll create one more. Thank you. Soli, the same question is to you. Also, there is a, I mean, would be able to, because of this multiplicity of crises and threats, when are we going to bypass this Cartesian worldview, you know, putting United States against Russia, now putting United States against China? Are we able to do that, or this is where we are bound to?
We'll have to. We will have to. I mean, but again, whether or not we will be able to do so is going to be, in my judgment, a function of whether or not Europe is going to be able to actually become a balancer between those two powers, number one. Number two, whether or not, I mean, by the way, Daron Acemoğlu had an article on precisely that matter, maybe a week or 10 days ago in Project Syndicate, when he suggested that both Europe and some of the regional powers will have to be able to have their own strategies and break the grip of the two major powers, China and the United States, over the world system. And he thinks if we have a more multipolar world, if we have a more kind of democratic world order, that will also have a good repercussion within the countries, and it will although it doesn't look likely today, it will help democracies to actually solidify their back as well. So that question is an important question. The answer will actually be shaped with what happens in the next decade. Again, 2021 is a period of is a year of transition. Remember that most European states are going to be terribly indebted. Most European companies are going to be terribly indebted. So Asian countries may be doing fine, but most of the world is going to have to manage a decline in revenues and a decline in economic prosperity. This is going to be a very difficult time, and choices made in 2021 will then probably give us the roadmap for the decade to come as well. And I suspect China will continue to be much more very assertive, and how the Americans respond to this is going to be important, and then we'll move on.
Let us finish with the last question about Turkey, because we haven't talked about Turkey. This was more about the global developments, but since I got you here, let me ask you about Turkey. We are getting signals and messages from the European Union, and we are getting signals and messages from the United States about Turkey's certain actions. And also, I think I'm getting several messages from Turkey too, both statements and also actions as well. Maybe one of the questions is saying that there are some comments on recent Turkey-Iran tension in terms of signal to Biden administration, for example. So could you put all this together and talk a little bit about Turkey into 2021? What could we expect? You already said Turkey has to make choices. What kind of choices we have to make?
First of all, I mean, you wrote, in my view, a truly excellent piece the other day.
I didn't pay you, but thank you.
No. If you wrote a shitty piece, I would have said so as well. But
I hope not. But yes, go ahead.
It was really a good paper. By the way, whatever is going to happen with the United States now is going to be determined by how Turkey manages this S-400 crisis, which actually led to CAATSA and whatever. So to behave as if we're so surprised that CAATSA has been implemented is unserious. And three former permanent representatives in NATO, Turkish ambassadors, have just co-written a piece in which they give a roadmap as to how we can actually resolve this matter and then actually move beyond the crisis that S-400 specifically create. With the European Union, we have a serious problem because we do not trust them, they do not trust us. And by the way, the same goes with the United States as well, but the United States can be more geopolitically oriented and actually can turn blind to a lot of things, whereas the Europeans presumably will not do that, and because we are much closer. I really do hope that the Biden administration will at least assume some of the responsibilities that the United States usually did in managing or brokering relations between Turkey and the European Union. It is my firm belief that for different reasons, both sides really at least need to have a civilized relationship and a dialogue that makes sense. As for Filiz Hanım's question, which I think is a very pertinent question, I doubt that the Americans are very unhappy that Turkey helped Azerbaijan gain its territory and reestablish its border with Iran. I'm sure the Israelis are also very happy. So on everything that may be cutting down Iran's influence, Iran's power, the Americans would be happy that Turkey had done such a thing. Whether or not the poem was a deliberately planted thing in the speech that our president gave, I really have no idea. It may also have been that they did not know the sensitivities of the Iranians on that matter, but it will be difficult. I mean, there will be, by the way, again, just like with Turkish-Russian relations, Turkey and Iran also have very different interests. They are competitors, but they also have been cooperating for 300, 400 years now. And that also is likely to continue. But if Turkey is put on the spot to make a choice between Iran and all the other regional powers and the United States, that is an important choice to make. And then we'll see if we have a debate on it. I don't think so, but what kind of decisions our rulers are going to make.
Okay. Thank you very much, Soli. Let me thank, before closing, let me thank GMF Turkey office, Özgür Ünlü Sarcıklıoğlu, who agreed to put together this event. And also let me thank our speakers today, Soli Özel from Kadir Has University, Ian Lesser from GMF Brussels office and GMF Vice President, and finally Alexandra the Hope Scheffer, Director of GMF Paris office. Thank you guys attending and listening. We'll see you in next event.